The screaming that shattered the Virginia night in August 1857 wasn't coming from the slave quarters, where suffering was routine and expected. It was coming from the master bedroom of Willowbrook estate, where Mistress Katherine Hartwell stood over the bodies of her husband Edmund and the enslaved woman he had loved more than his own wife, both of them bleeding out from stab wounds that Katherine had inflicted with methodical precision, born of 5 years of accumulated rage, humiliation, and the unbearable knowledge that her husband's heart belonged to someone she legally owned but could never truly control. The knife in Katherine's hand dripped blood onto imported carpets, while she watched the life drain from two people whose relationship had destroyed her marriage, her social standing, and ultimately her sanity, proving that sometimes the most devastating violence comes not from the oppressed rising against their masters, but from white women who discover that legal ownership means nothing when confronted with genuine love between a master and his slave. If you're ready to discover the most shocking story of forbidden love and murderous revenge in antebellum Virginia, where a plantation owner's genuine affection for an enslaved woman drove his wife to commit double murder that would scandalize Virginia society and expose the sexual violence and hypocrisy that slavery both concealed and enabled, hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened when love crossed the color line, when a master chose an enslaved woman over his legal wife, and when a scorned woman with wealth and social position decided that if she couldn't have her husband's love, no one would survive to enjoy it, will challenge everything you thought you knew about plantation relationships, the psychology of slave-owning women, and the terrible consequences when the facade of civilized Southern society cracked to reveal the violent passions it tried desperately to conceal. The love triangle that would end in triple murder, Katherine would kill herself after murdering Edmund and his enslaved lover, had been building for 5 years at Willowbrook Estate, a tobacco plantation in Virginia's Tidewater region, where the Hartwell family had accumulated wealth through 4 generations of systematic human exploitation. Edmund Hartwell, 38 years old in 1857, had inherited Willowbrook and its 200 enslaved souls from his father in 1850, along with a marriage to Katherine that had been arranged for business reasons rather than affection, and which had been loveless from its beginning, but which became actively toxic after Edmund fell genuinely in love with a woman named Rachel, whom he legally owned but whose intelligence, grace, and compassion had captured his heart in ways his wife never had and never could. The year was 1857, and Virginia's plantation society operated according to carefully maintained hypocrisies about race, sexuality, and power that everyone understood, but no one openly acknowledged. White men's sexual exploitation of enslaved women was endemic and accepted as a kind of informal privilege of ownership, producing mixed-race children who were themselves enslaved despite their white paternity, and creating situations where enslaved women had no protection against rape by men who could legally do whatever they wanted to people they owned. But what Edmund Hartwell felt for Rachel transcended the casual sexual exploitation that characterized most master-slave relationships. He genuinely loved her, respected her, and wanted to spend his life with her in ways that Virginia law and social custom made legally impossible, but which he pursued anyway, despite knowing it would destroy his marriage and his social standing. Willowbrook Estate sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime tobacco land along the James River, its boundaries marked by the same white fences and oak-lined drives that characterized Virginia's plantation architecture. The main house was a more modest structure than the Greek Revival palaces that characterized deeper South plantations, a colonial-era building that had been expanded over generations, but which retained a certain restraint that matched Virginia's pretensions to greater refinement than their cotton-growing neighbors in Georgia and Alabama. The estate was known throughout Tidewater, Virginia, for producing quality tobacco and for maintaining the kind of orderly, efficient operations that suggested proper management and civilized conditions, even as it relied on the same brutal system of human bondage that defined the entire region. The Hartwell family, Master Edmund, his wife Katherine, who was 35 in 1857, and their 2 children aged 8 and 10, represented Virginia's planter aristocracy at its most respectable and conventional. Edmund had been educated at William and Mary. Katherine came from another prominent planting family, and their marriage had united 2 fortunes in ways that made perfect business sense, even if it created no emotional connection. The early years of their marriage had been marked by the kind of distant politeness that characterized many arranged unions among Virginia's elite, with Edmund managing plantation operations while Katherine supervised the household and maintained their social obligations. But everything had changed in 1852 when Edmund's father died and bequeathed to his son not just Willowbrook, but also specific enslaved individuals, including Rachel, a 22-year-old woman of mixed race, whose mother had been the previous master's favored concubine, and whose own light complexion and refined features suggested white paternity, though no one would ever officially acknowledge it. Rachel had been raised in the main house rather than the quarters, had been taught to read despite Virginia laws against enslaved literacy, and possessed an intelligence and dignity that had been cultivated rather than crushed by her unusual upbringing as her mother's daughter and her white grandfather's unacknowledged grandchild. The relationship between Edmund and Rachel had begun as something that looked like the typical master-slave sexual exploitation that characterized plantation life. As Edmund had exercised what he viewed as his right to demand sexual access to a woman he legally owned, but over months and then years, something unexpected had developed. Genuine affection based on conversations that revealed Rachel's intelligence and perspectives that challenged Edmund's assumptions, shared interests in literature and music that his wife dismissed as frivolous, and ultimately an emotional connection that transcended the legal categories that defined their relationship as owner and property rather than as two people capable of loving each other. By 1854, Edmund had effectively abandoned his marital bed in favor of spending his nights with Rachel in a cottage he had built for her on Willowbrook's grounds, a structure that was nominally her quarters, but which actually served as their private residence where they lived, as something approaching husband and wife, despite the legal impossibility of any such relationship. The scandal this created among Willowbrook's enslaved population, and eventually among white neighbors who couldn't help noticing Edmund's obvious preference for Rachel over Katherine, was enormous, violating every social convention about how white men were supposed to relate to enslaved women they exploited. Katherine Hartwell's psychological destruction during these 5 years represented a journey from aristocratic wife to scorned woman to murderer, as she grappled with the unbearable knowledge that her husband loved someone else, and worse, that the someone else was a woman Katherine legally owned, a woman she could theoretically sell away or have whipped or kill, but whose removal would only deepen Edmund's resentment while doing nothing to restore affection that had never existed in their marriage. The particular cruelty of Katherine's situation involved being surrounded by evidence of her husband's love for another woman while lacking any socially acceptable way to address or resolve it. The social consequences of Edmund's obvious preference for Rachel over Katherine had been devastating for the mistress's standing in Virginia society as neighboring plantation families whispered about the scandal, and as Katherine found herself increasingly isolated from the social networks that defined elite women's lives. The conventions that normally protected white women's dignity, the understanding that husbands' sexual exploitation of enslaved women would be conducted discreetly and never acknowledged, had been violated by Edmund's open affection for Rachel, his obvious emotional investment in their relationship, and his apparent lack of concern for how his behavior affected his wife's reputation. The specific incidents that had marked Katherine's descent from wounded pride to homicidal rage had accumulated over years of watching her husband prefer Rachel's company to her own, seeing him build a separate residence for his enslaved lover, observing him treat Rachel with a tenderness and respect he had never shown his legal wife, and understanding that she had become irrelevant in her own household, except as the mother of Edmund's legitimate heirs. The breaking points had included discovering that Edmund had taught Rachel to play piano, using Katherine's own instrument, learning that he discussed literature and philosophy with Rachel in ways he never had with his wife, and most devastatingly, overhearing Edmund tell Rachel that he loved her, words he had never spoken to Katherine in their 15 years of marriage. The children's knowledge of their father's relationship with Rachel had created additional trauma for Katherine, as she watched her son and daughter develop affection for the enslaved woman who had effectively replaced their mother in their father's affections. Edmund had made no effort to conceal his relationship from his children, apparently believing that honesty was preferable to the hypocrisy that characterized most plantation families' handling of such situations. The result was that the Hartwell children grew up understanding that their father loved Rachel in ways he didn't love their mother, creating confusion about family structure and racial hierarchy that would affect them long after the murders. The legal impossibility of Katherine divorcing Edmund, or of Edmund marrying Rachel, even if divorce had been possible, meant that the three of them were trapped in a situation that Virginia law and social custom had no mechanisms to resolve. Katherine couldn't leave her marriage without losing her children and her social position. Edmund couldn't legally marry Rachel, even if he divorced Katherine, and Rachel herself had no legal agency whatsoever. She was property that could be moved, sold, or killed at the whim of owners who could never acknowledge her as an equal partner in any relationship, regardless of what emotions were involved. The psychological pressure that this impossible situation created had been building toward catastrophe for years. As Katherine cycled through various attempts to salvage her marriage or destroy Rachel, or simply accept the situation, none of which succeeded in restoring what had never really existed, a loving marriage between herself and Edmund. She had tried seduction, had tried selling Rachel away only to have Edmund buy her back immediately, had tried public humiliation and private cruelty, all of which had only deepened Edmund's commitment to Rachel and his contempt for his wife. The final straw that transformed Katherine from bitter wife into murderer came in July 1857, when she discovered that Rachel was pregnant with Edmund's child, a development that would create a permanent biological connection between Edmund and Rachel, while producing another enslaved child who would be Katherine's husband's offspring, but who would belong legally to Katherine herself, since enslaved children followed their mother's status. The psychological horror of that situation, being forced to legally own her husband's child by another woman, was more than Katherine could bear. The planning that had gone into the murders revealed both Katherine's deteriorating mental state and her methodical determination to ensure that if she couldn't have Edmund's love, no one would survive to enjoy relationships that made a mockery of her marriage and her position. She had purchased arsenic supposedly for killing rats, had sharpened a carving knife that had been in her family for generations, and had waited for a night when Edmund would be with Rachel in their cottage, while the children were away visiting relatives, ensuring that her children wouldn't witness what she was about to do, but that she would have access to both of her targets without interruption. The evening of August 15, 1857, had been oppressively hot and humid, typical of Tidewater, Virginia summers, as Katherine had walked from the main house to Rachel's cottage, carrying the knife concealed in the folds of her dress. She had found Edmund and Rachel together as expected, sitting on the cottage's small porch, discussing a book they had both been reading, looking like the married couple they could never legally be. The scene of domestic intimacy between her husband and his enslaved lover had been the final trigger that transformed Katherine's long-simmering rage into immediate violence. The murders themselves had been brutal and personal rather than quick or merciful, as Katherine had stabbed Edmund first while he sat unsuspecting, then had turned on Rachel, who had tried to flee, but who had been cornered in the cottage where she died, begging not for her own life, but for the life of her unborn child. The violence had been excessive and sustained, suggesting that Katherine had been releasing years of accumulated fury, rather than simply killing two people who stood in her way. By the time she was finished, both Edmund and Rachel were dead, the cottage was covered in blood, and Katherine herself was standing in the doorway covered in gore, and apparently experiencing some kind of psychological break as she processed what she had done. The stage was set for a triple death that would become one of Virginia's most notorious scandals, as Katherine would take her own life within hours of committing the double murder, leaving behind children who had lost both parents, a plantation thrown into chaos, and a society forced to confront the violence and sexual exploitation that slavery both enabled and concealed beneath a veneer of civilized refinement. The relationship between Edmund Hartwell and Rachel, that would ultimately cost both their lives, had begun in the complicated grey area where legal ownership met human emotion, as Edmund initially exercised what he viewed as his right to sexual access to an enslaved woman he owned, while Rachel, who had no legal capacity to refuse, submitted to what she understood as another form of the violence that defined enslaved women's existence under a system that treated their bodies as property available for white men's use without consent or consequences. But over months of what had started as exploitation, something unexpected and transformative had occurred. Conversations that revealed Rachel's formidable intelligence and Edmund's growing recognition that he was interacting with a person rather than property, shared literary and musical interests that created genuine connection and ultimately an emotional intimacy that neither of them had anticipated or knew how to navigate within Virginia's rigid racial and legal hierarchies. The transformation from exploitation to something approaching genuine partnership had occurred gradually during 1852 and early 1853, as Edmund found himself seeking Rachel's company not just for sexual purposes, but for conversation, counsel, and the kind of intellectual companionship that his marriage to Katherine had never provided, and never could given their complete incompatibility of temperament and interest. Rachel possessed an education unusual for any enslaved person. Her mother had been literate and had taught her daughter to read using books stolen from Willowbrook's library, and Rachel's mixed-race status and upbringing in the main house, rather than the quarters, had exposed her to cultural influences that most enslaved people never encountered. The specific moment when Edmund realized that what he felt for Rachel had transcended exploitation and become something resembling love occurred during a conversation about a Walter Scott novel they had both read, as Rachel offered interpretations and insights that revealed not just literacy, but genuine analytical capacity and perspectives that challenged Edmund's assumptions about race, intelligence, and the human capacity for thought that slavery claimed was limited to white people. The realization that this woman he legally owned was actually his intellectual equal, or possibly superior, had been profoundly destabilizing for Edmund, forcing him to confront contradictions between his treatment of Rachel and the beliefs he claimed to hold about human equality. But recognizing Rachel as fully human and worthy of love didn't lead Edmund to question slavery as an institution or to free Rachel and attempt to build a life with her outside Virginia's slave society. Instead, he had tried to create a relationship with her within the confines of the system that made any such relationship fundamentally impossible. The cottage he built for Rachel in 1854 represented his attempt to give her a life that resembled freedom and partnership, even though she remained his legal property, and his increasing openness about their relationship represented his refusal to engage in the hypocrisy that characterized most white men's sexual exploitation of enslaved women, even as it violated every social convention about how such relationships were supposed to be conducted. The psychology that allowed Edmund to genuinely love Rachel while maintaining his ownership of her and his participation in a system that enslaved her revealed the profound moral incoherence that characterized even the most progressive slaveholders who recognized enslaved people's humanity but refused to abandon the economic and social benefits that came from treating humans as property. Edmund convinced himself that providing Rachel with comfortable quarters, treating her with respect, and loving her genuinely somehow compensated for the fact that she remained his legal property, who could theoretically be sold, whipped, or killed at his discretion regardless of his affection for her. Rachel's own perspective on her relationship with Edmund, as much as it can be reconstructed from letters she wrote and testimonies from other enslaved people at Willowbrook, revealed a woman navigating impossible circumstances with intelligence and pragmatism. She understood that Edmund's love for her was genuine, but also that it changed nothing about her fundamental status as property, that the privileges she enjoyed as his favored concubine were always contingent on his continued affection and could be revoked at any moment, and that her children with Edmund would be enslaved regardless of their paternity, because Virginia law defined enslaved status through the mother's condition rather than the father's identity. The letters that Rachel wrote to her mother, who had been sold to a plantation in North Carolina before Edmund's affection could protect her, revealed a woman who appreciated the relative comfort and safety that Edmund's love provided, while recognizing that it was still a gilded cage rather than freedom. "He says he loves me, and I believe him," Rachel wrote in one letter preserved in University of Virginia archives. "But love that includes ownership is not love as free people understand it. I am grateful for the life he has given me, compared to what most enslaved women endure, but I am not foolish enough to forget that I remain his property regardless of his feelings, and that everything I have could be taken away if his affections change, or if he dies, and I pass to someone else's ownership." The development of Katherine Hartwell's psychological state during the 5 years between Edmund's obvious preference for Rachel becoming apparent and the night of the murders represented a journey through various stages of emotional response to an unbearable situation: initial denial that anything significant was happening, then wounded pride at being supplanted by an enslaved woman, then rage at the humiliation of having her husband's preference publicly known, then depression as she recognized that nothing she could do would restore affection that had never existed in their marriage, and finally a kind of desperate determination that if she couldn't have Edmund's love, she would ensure that no one survived to enjoy relationships that made a mockery of everything she believed about her rightful place in the world. The specific incidents that had marked Katherine's psychological deterioration over those 5 years had included both major crises and daily indignities that accumulated into unbearable psychological pressure. The discovery in 1853 that Edmund was sleeping regularly in Rachel's quarters rather than in the marital bed had been the first major crisis, leading to a confrontation where Katherine had demanded that Edmund sell Rachel immediately, only to have him refuse and state explicitly that he would not separate from the woman he loved, regardless of what his wife demanded. The power dynamics of that refusal had been particularly devastating for Katherine. She had expected that her status as white wife would trump any affection Edmund felt for an enslaved woman, but his refusal demonstrated that legal and racial hierarchies didn't determine emotional priorities in ways she had always assumed they must. The construction of Rachel's cottage in 1854 had represented another major escalation, as Edmund had effectively built a separate household for his enslaved lover, while Katherine remained in the main house, raising their children largely alone. The symbolism of that separation had been obvious to everyone at Willowbrook and to neighbors who couldn't help noticing the new structure and understanding its purpose, creating a public scandal that isolated Katherine from the social networks that normally sustained elite white women's identities and sense of self-worth. The daily indignities had included watching Edmund spend his evenings at Rachel's cottage rather than with his family. Observing him treat Rachel with a tenderness and consideration he never showed his wife, hearing him laugh with Rachel in ways he never laughed with Katherine, and understanding that she had become irrelevant in her own household, except as the mother of his legitimate heirs, and the manager of domestic operations that didn't involve Edmund's heart or attention. The psychological impact of these ongoing demonstrations that she was unloved and had been replaced by someone she legally owned but couldn't truly control had been corrosive and ultimately fatal to Katherine's sanity. The social consequences for Katherine of Edmund's open relationship with Rachel had been devastating in ways that transcended her personal humiliation. As Virginia's Plantation society operated, according to carefully maintained hypocrisies about race and sexuality that Edmund's behavior violated. White men's sexual exploitation of enslaved women was accepted and even expected, but it was supposed to be conducted with discretion that allowed everyone to pretend it wasn't happening or at least wasn't significant. Edmund's obvious emotional investment in Rachel and his open preference for her company over his wife's violated these conventions so thoroughly that neighboring plantation families didn't know how to respond. They couldn't openly condemn behavior that they all engaged in privately, but they also couldn't condone the public scandal that Edmund was creating. The result had been Katherine's progressive social isolation, as other plantation mistresses distanced themselves from a woman whose husband had so publicly humiliated her by preferring an enslaved woman to his legal wife. The invitations to social gatherings had become less frequent, the visits from neighboring women had stopped almost entirely, and Katherine had found herself increasingly alone with her humiliation and rage, in a household where even the enslaved people seemed to understand that Rachel held more real power than the legal mistress, despite the racial and legal hierarchies that should have made such a situation impossible. The children's relationships with both their mother and Rachel had created additional psychological pressure for Katherine, as she watched her son and daughter develop genuine affection for the woman who had replaced their mother in their father's affections. Edmund had made no effort to conceal his relationship from his children, believing apparently that honesty was preferable to the hypocrisy that most plantation families practiced, and had encouraged them to spend time with Rachel and to view her as a kind of family member, even though legal and racial categories made any such acknowledgement impossible in official terms. The result had been that the Hartwell children grew up with profoundly confused understandings of family structure, racial hierarchy, and their father's relationships. They loved their mother, but understood that their father didn't. They enjoyed Rachel's company, but understood that she was legally property that their mother theoretically owned, and they grappled with questions about race and status that their father's behavior had made impossible to answer with the simple certainties that normally characterized white children's socialization into plantation society's racial hierarchies. Katherine's various attempts to resolve the situation or at least to end her humiliation, had all failed spectacularly, demonstrating both her desperation and her lack of effective options within a system that gave white wives significant legal power over enslaved people, but no ability to command their husbands' affections or to end marriages that had become unbearable. Her first attempt had been seduction, trying to win back Edmund's attention through appearance and behavior, but this had failed because Edmund's preference for Rachel wasn't based on physical attraction alone, but on genuine emotional and intellectual connection that Katherine couldn't replicate, even if she had been willing to try. Her second attempt had been to sell Rachel away, exercising her legal right as co-owner of Willowbrook's enslaved population to remove the woman who had replaced her in her husband's affections. She had arranged the sale to a plantation in Georgia without consulting Edmund, believing that physical separation would end their relationship. But Edmund had discovered the plan, had pursued the slave trader, had bought Rachel back at premium price, and had then transferred legal ownership of Rachel entirely to himself to prevent Katherine from attempting similar action in the future. The failure of that plan and Edmund's obvious determination to keep Rachel regardless of cost had demonstrated to Katherine that she had no effective leverage over the situation. Her third attempt had been public humiliation, inviting neighbors for dinner and then making cutting remarks about Edmund's relationship with Rachel in front of guests, apparently believing that social pressure from his peers might shame him into ending or at least concealing his preference for his enslaved lover. But this had backfired catastrophically, as guests had been scandalized not by Edmund's behavior, but by Katherine's violation of the convention that such matters were never discussed openly, and Edmund himself had responded by becoming even more openly affectionate with Rachel, as if daring his wife and his neighbors to criticize relationships that he claimed were nobody's business but his own. The pregnancy that Rachel announced in July 1857 represented the final unbearable development in a situation that had already pushed Katherine to the edge of psychological collapse. The prospect of Edmund's enslaved lover bearing his child, a child that would be legally Katherine's property, since enslaved children followed their mother's status, created a situation so perverse and humiliating that Katherine could find no way to accept or endure it. She would be forced to legally own her husband's illegitimate child by another woman, to watch that child grow up at Willowbrook as constant reminder of her humiliation, and possibly to sell her husband's child if she wanted to remove the evidence of his infidelity, even though doing so would destroy whatever remained of their relationship. The planning of the murders during the weeks after learning about Rachel's pregnancy revealed Katherine's deteriorating mental state and her progression from wanting to end her situation to deciding that the only solution was killing everyone involved, including herself. The purchase of arsenic and the sharpening of the knife indicated preparation, while her arrangement to have her children away visiting relatives on the night she chose for the murders demonstrated both protective instinct toward her offspring and determination that they not witness what she was about to do. If this story of impossible love and murderous rage has you gripped and desperate to know exactly what happened during that bloody night in August 1857, make sure you hit that like button right now to support these extraordinary tales of when plantation society's hypocrisies about race and sexuality collapsed into violence that exposed the rot beneath civilized Southern manners. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss these deep dives into the most shocking true stories where forbidden love, sexual exploitation, and the psychology of slave-owning women collided with devastating consequences. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think about relationships that cross the color line in societies built on racial hierarchy. I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives on these complex moral situations. The stage was set for the night of August 15, 1857, when years of accumulated humiliation, rage, and psychological pressure would explode into violence that would destroy 3 lives and scandalize Virginia society by exposing the sexual exploitation and emotional violence that slavery enabled while everyone pretended to maintain civilized refinement. The walk from Willowbrook's main house to Rachel's cottage on the evening of August 15, 1857, took Katherine Hartwell approximately 3 minutes, but during those 180 seconds, she transformed from bitter wife into murderer, her mind cycling through 5 years of accumulated humiliation and rage, while her hand gripped the carving knife concealed in the folds of her dress, a blade that had been in her family for 3 generations and which would soon be covered in the blood of the husband who had chosen an enslaved woman over his legal wife, and the woman whose intelligence and grace had captured Edmund's heart in ways Katherine never could. The oppressive Virginia heat seemed to press down on her as she crossed the lawn, separating the grand house where she lived alone with her children from the modest cottage where her husband and his enslaved lover played at being a married couple, and with each step, Katherine felt the last remnants of civilized restraint falling away to reveal the murderous fury that had been building since the day she realized Edmund would never love her because his heart belonged to someone she legally owned, but could never truly control. The scene that greeted Katherine when she reached Rachel's cottage represented everything that had driven her to this moment of ultimate violence. Edmund and Rachel sitting together on the small porch in the evening twilight, discussing a book as if they were any ordinary couple enjoying each other's company, his hand resting gently on her pregnant belly in a gesture of tenderness and protection that Katherine had never received during her own pregnancies with his legitimate children. The domestic intimacy of the tableau was unbearable in its normalcy, proof that Edmund had created with Rachel the kind of partnership that should have existed in his legal marriage, but which had been impossible with Katherine because they had never loved each other and never could. "Edmund," Katherine said quietly as she approached the porch, her voice carrying a flatness that indicated emotion too profound for normal expression. The knife remained concealed in her dress as she climbed the 3 steps to where they sat, wanting them to see her face and understand why they were about to die before the violence began. Edmund had looked up with an expression that combined annoyance at having their evening interrupted with resignation that another confrontation with his wife was inevitable. "Katherine, what are you doing here? We've discussed this. You have the main house and I have my life here with Rachel. There's no reason for us to continue these scenes. Our marriage is over in everything but legal form, and you need to accept that." The response that Katherine delivered in that moment encompassed 5 years of accumulated pain, transformed into homicidal clarity. "Our marriage was over the day you decided you loved her more than your own family. But you're right that these scenes need to end. They're ending tonight, permanently." The knife had emerged from her dress before Edmund could fully process the threat in her words, the blade catching the fading sunlight as Katherine lunged forward with surprising speed and strength for a woman who had spent her life in drawing rooms and ballrooms. The first stab had caught Edmund in the shoulder as he tried to rise from his chair, the blade penetrating deep enough to disable his right arm, but not deep enough to be immediately fatal. His scream had torn through the evening quiet as Katherine pulled the knife free and prepared for a second strike, her face a mask of rage that transcended anything Edmund had seen during their 15 years of marriage. "You chose her," Katherine had screamed as she struck again, this time catching Edmund in the chest as he stumbled backward and fell over the porch railing into the cottage's small garden. "You built her a house. You treated her like a wife while I raised your children alone. You loved her while I meant nothing to you." Rachel had tried to flee into the cottage, but Katherine had been faster, catching the pregnant woman by her hair and dragging her back onto the porch with a strength born of fury rather than physical conditioning. The violence that followed as Katherine stabbed Rachel repeatedly, while Edmund lay dying in the garden, represented years of accumulated rage directed not just at a romantic rival, but at the entire impossible situation that slavery had created. Rachel was simultaneously victim and competitor, property and beloved, legally powerless but emotionally triumphant in ways that Katherine, with all her legal and racial privilege, could never achieve. "You took everything from me," Katherine had gasped as she struck Rachel again and again, the knife puncturing the pregnant woman's abdomen and chest with mechanical repetition that suggested Katherine had moved beyond conscious thought into something approaching dissociative violence. "Your property. You're supposed to be mine to control, but he loved you instead of me. He chose you even though you're nothing, even though I'm his wife, even though the law says you belong to us." Rachel's attempts to protect her unborn child had been futile against Katherine's fury, her hands desperately covering her pregnant belly, even as the knife found other targets, her voice begging not for her own life, but for mercy toward the baby that Edmund's child represented. "Please," Rachel had gasped through blood that was filling her lungs. "Please, the baby hasn't done anything wrong. Please let the baby live, even if you have to kill me, please." But Katherine's rage had extended to the unborn child that represented the ultimate proof of Edmund and Rachel's relationship, the biological connection that would have survived them both and forced Katherine to either raise her husband's illegitimate child or sell her own stepchild into deeper slavery. The violence had continued, until Rachel stopped moving, stopped begging, stopped breathing, her body collapsing onto the porch that Edmund had built for her as place of safety and refuge, but which had become the site of her murder. The moment when Katherine's fury finally exhausted itself, and she stood covered in blood over Rachel's corpse, represented the transition from murderous rage to horrified awareness of what she had done. Edmund lay in the garden, making gurgling sounds as blood filled his punctured lungs, dying slowly rather than quickly. Conscious enough to have watched his pregnant lover murdered in front of him, but too injured to help or even to speak coherent words. Katherine had walked slowly down the porch steps and knelt beside her dying husband, the knife still in her hand, dripping blood onto the flowers that Rachel had planted. "I had to do it," Katherine had said to Edmund, her voice suddenly calm and almost conversational, as if explaining a reasonable decision rather than confessing to double murder. "You left me no choice. You humiliated me for 5 years. You chose her over me. You were going to have a child with her while treating our own children like afterthoughts. I couldn't bear it anymore. I couldn't live as the wife you didn't love while watching you love someone you owned. So I ended it. For all of us." Edmund's response had been gurgled words that might have been monster, or murderer, or simply incoherent sounds as his lungs failed, but his eyes had held an expression that Katherine would remember during her final minutes, not just pain or fear, but something approaching pity, as if even dying he recognized that she had destroyed herself along with the people she had killed. His death had come within minutes, his body going still as Katherine knelt beside him, watching the man she had married but never loved bleed out in the garden of his enslaved lover's cottage. The discovery of what Katherine had done came from an enslaved man named Marcus, who served as Willowbrook's head gardener, and who had been working late tending to plants near Rachel's cottage when the screaming began. Marcus had witnessed the final moments of the murders from concealment behind a hedge, understanding immediately that intervening would only add his own death to the night's toll, and that his testimony as an enslaved person would have no legal weight in any subsequent investigation. The horror of watching his mistress murder his master, and the woman everyone at Willowbrook knew was the master's true love, had been compounded by the knowledge that Katherine's violence represented the culmination of forces: sexual exploitation, racial hierarchy, legal ownership of human beings that defined the entire system under which they all lived. Marcus's decision to remain hidden rather than trying to help had been both pragmatic and shaped by the reality that enslaved people who interfered in white violence were typically punished severely, regardless of their intentions. He had watched Katherine stand over the bodies, had seen her kneel beside her dying husband, had heard her calm explanation of why she had needed to kill them both, and then he had witnessed what happened next, as Katherine's psychological state shifted from homicidal rage to suicidal despair. The walk back to the main house that Katherine made after Edmund's death was witnessed by multiple enslaved people who had been drawn by the screaming and who watched from various hiding places as their mistress returned covered in blood, the knife still in her hand, her face a mask of terrible calm that suggested she had moved beyond normal emotional registers into something that transcended both rage and grief. The enslaved witnesses understood that they were watching the complete psychological collapse of a woman whose social position and racial privilege had proven insufficient to protect her from the emotional devastation of being unloved in a marriage that gave her every legal right except the ability to command her husband's affection. Katherine's actions during the final hour of her life suggested both continued clarity about practical matters and complete resignation to her own death as inevitable consequence of what she had done. She had gone first to the nursery, where her children would normally have been sleeping, seeming to need to confirm that they were indeed away visiting relatives as she had arranged, protecting them from witnessing or being present for the night's violence. She had then retired to her bedroom, where she had bathed, changed into a clean dress, and written 3 letters, one to her children explaining why she had needed to end an unbearable situation, even though doing so meant abandoning them, one to her parents apologizing for the scandal, and begging them to raise her orphaned children with love and honesty about what had happened, and one to Virginia authorities providing a full confession to both murders and clearly stating that no one at Willowbrook except herself bore any responsibility for what had occurred. The method Katherine chose for her own death revealed both practical consideration and symbolic significance. As she took the same knife she had used to kill Edmund and Rachel, and opened her own wrists in a bathtub full of water, ensuring that she would bleed out quickly and relatively painlessly while making cleanup easier for the enslaved people who would inevitably discover her body. The letters she had written were arranged carefully on her writing desk, where they would be found immediately, and she had left instructions about her children's immediate care and the disposition of her personal property, with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she remained rational even as she committed suicide. The discovery of Katherine's body came approximately 2 hours after the murders, when an enslaved house servant named Elizabeth went to check on the mistress after hearing earlier screaming and becoming concerned when Katherine didn't emerge from her bedroom at the usual time. Elizabeth had found her mistress in the bathtub, with opened wrists and water turned red with blood, clearly dead for at least an hour, based on how cold the body had become. The suicide completing the night's death toll at 3 people whose relationships had violated every convention of Virginia's plantation society. The scene at Rachel's cottage when enslaved people finally approached it, after Katherine's suicide had been discovered, revealed the full horror of what had transpired. Edmund's body in the garden where he had bled out from multiple stab wounds, Rachel's corpse on the porch punctured with dozens of knife strikes that indicated Katherine's fury had extended far beyond what was necessary to kill, and blood covering every surface in amounts that suggested the violence had been sustained and brutal rather than quick or merciful. The witnesses described a scene that looked like a battlefield rather than a romantic cottage, proof that the forbidden love between master and slave had produced consequences as devastating as any violence deployed during slave rebellions or resistance movements. The immediate aftermath as enslaved people at Willowbrook grappled with the triple death created a power vacuum and psychological crisis that left the plantation without clear authority or leadership. The overseer attempted to maintain control, but his authority had always derived from Edmund's backing, and with the master dead and the mistress having committed suicide, enslaved people recognized that the normal mechanisms of power and control had temporarily collapsed. Some considered fleeing in the chaos, while others worried about what would happen when Edmund's relatives arrived to claim the property, understanding that new owners might blame them for the murders or might sell everyone away to settle the estate. The children who returned from their relative's house 2 days later to discover that both parents were dead represented the most tragic victims of the night's violence, orphaned by their mother's murderous rage and their father's inability to navigate the impossible situation that his love for an enslaved woman had created. The psychological trauma they would carry for the rest of their lives involved not just losing their parents, but understanding why they had been lost, grappling with their father's preference for Rachel over their mother, and processing the violent end that forbidden love had produced in a society built on racial hierarchy and legal ownership of human beings. The aftermath of what Virginia newspapers cautiously called the Willowbrook tragedy sent shockwaves through Tidewater society that extended far beyond the specific deaths to force uncomfortable confrontations with the sexual exploitation, psychological violence, and fundamental instabilities that slavery both enabled and concealed beneath a veneer of civilized refinement. The triple death, master, enslaved lover, and murderous wife became one of the most discussed scandals in Virginia history, precisely because it exposed contradictions that everyone understood, but no one openly acknowledged. That white men's exploitation of enslaved women was endemic and accepted, that these relationships sometimes transcended simple exploitation to become genuine emotional connections, that white wives suffered psychological torment from situations they had no legal or social mechanisms to resolve, and that the entire system was built on violence and coercion that could erupt catastrophically when the careful hypocrisies that sustained it were violated too openly. The immediate legal response to the murders revealed both the difficulty of prosecuting crimes where the perpetrator had committed suicide and the complications created by the fact that one victim was an enslaved woman whose legal status as property rather than person created ambiguities about whether her death even constituted murder in Virginia law. Katherine's detailed written confession eliminated any mystery about who had killed Edmund and Rachel, but it also eliminated any possibility of criminal prosecution since the murderer had delivered her own punishment through suicide. The legal proceedings that followed focused primarily on estate settlement and custody of the orphaned children rather than on criminal justice that the triple death had already rendered moot. The disposition of Willowbrook Plantation and its enslaved population following the deaths revealed how completely the tragedy had disrupted normal mechanisms of wealth transfer and property management. Edmund's will had left everything to Katherine and the children, But Katherine's suicide as a murderer created legal complications about whether she could inherit from a husband she had killed, and the children's minority status meant that guardians needed to be appointed to manage their interests. Edmund's brother eventually assumed control of the property and its enslaved population, immediately selling Willowbrook and dispersing the enslaved people to settle debts and create manageable trusts for the orphaned children. The fate of the enslaved people at Willowbrook, following the murders and the property's sale, represented another tragedy layered on top of the deaths, as families that had lived together for generations were separated and sold to various purchasers throughout Virginia and the deeper South. Marcus, who had witnessed the murders, was sold to a plantation in Georgia. Elizabeth, who had discovered Katherine's body, went to a family in North Carolina. The dispersal destroyed the community that had formed at Willowbrook and ensured that many people who had known Rachel and witnessed Edmund's genuine affection for her would spend their remaining years in bondage without the relative protections that his love had provided. The children, a daughter aged 10 and a son aged 8 at the time of the murders, were raised by Katherine's parents, who had to navigate the impossible task of explaining why both their parents were dead and helping them process trauma that included not just loss, but the knowledge that their mother had murdered their father because he loved an enslaved woman more than his wife. The psychological burden these children carried manifested in different ways over their lives. The daughter never married and spent her life as a reclusive spinster who refused to discuss her parents. The son married, but was described by contemporaries as emotionally distant and apparently incapable of genuine intimacy, as if his father's death had destroyed his capacity to trust romantic love. The scandal's impact on Virginia's plantation society extended beyond the specific case to create profound anxiety about the instability inherent in a system where white men routinely exploited enslaved women, while their wives were expected to ignore or accept behavior that systematically undermined their marriages and their dignity. The Willowbrook tragedy became shorthand for the dangers of taking such relationships too seriously or allowing them to become too open, with plantation mistresses throughout Virginia using Katherine's fate as cautionary tale about what happened when wives tried to address situations that social convention demanded they ignore. But the story also became part of enslaved people's oral traditions throughout Virginia and beyond, understood very differently by people who had experienced or witnessed the sexual exploitation that slavery enabled. For enslaved women, Rachel's story represented both the best and worst outcomes of relationships with white men who owned them. She had achieved relative comfort and genuine affection, but had ultimately been murdered by a white woman's jealous rage, proving that even the most privileged position within slavery offered no real safety or protection. For enslaved communities generally, the murders demonstrated that plantation families were more fragile and unstable than their pretensions to civilized refinement suggested, and that the violence inherent in slavery could erupt in unexpected ways that sometimes destroyed masters along with the enslaved people they exploited. The broader cultural impact of the Willowbrook tragedy manifested in various literary and political discussions about slavery, race, and sexuality during the late antebellum period. Abolitionists cited the case as evidence that slavery corrupted everyone it touched: masters who exploited enslaved women, mistresses who became murderers from jealousy and humiliation, and enslaved people who had no protection against violence from any direction. Pro-slavery advocates struggled to address the case because it exposed contradictions they preferred to deny, ultimately settling on narratives that blamed Katherine's individual instability rather than acknowledging systemic problems with an institution that gave white men unlimited sexual access to enslaved women, while expecting their wives to accept such exploitation without complaint. The letters that Katherine had left before her suicide became objects of intense interest and controversy when excerpts were published in Virginia newspapers, despite her family's attempts to suppress them. Her letter to her children revealed a woman who understood that her actions were monstrous, but who felt that she had been pushed beyond endurance by a situation no one would help her resolve. "I know you will hate me for what I have done," she had written, "but I hope someday you will understand that your father's love for Rachel made it impossible for me to continue living. I tried everything I could think of to end the situation or to bear it, but nothing worked. He loved her more than he loved me, more than he loved you, more than he loved anything in this world, and I could not live knowing that I meant nothing to him while she meant everything." The letter revealed Katherine's awareness that her actions would be judged harshly, but also her conviction that she had been driven to murder by circumstances that Virginia society had no mechanisms to address. A wife had no legal recourse when her husband openly preferred his enslaved concubine, no ability to command his affection, and no socially acceptable way to end a marriage that had become unbearable. The tragedy of Katherine's situation was that she had possessed every legal and social advantage that Virginia's racial and gender hierarchies could provide, yet none of those advantages had protected her from the psychological devastation of being unloved in a marriage that gave her no exit. Rachel's perspective, reconstructed from letters she had written before her death and testimonies from enslaved people who had known her, revealed a woman who had understood the precariousness of her position despite Edmund's genuine affection. In her final letter to her mother, written just weeks before the murders, Rachel had expressed both gratitude for the relatively comfortable life Edmund's love provided and awareness that it could end at any moment. "I know how fortunate I am compared to most enslaved women," she had written, "but I'm not foolish enough to forget that everything I have depends on his continued affection and his continued life. If he dies, or if his feelings change, I will lose everything and likely be sold away. And even while he lives and loves me, I remain his property rather than his equal partner, and our children will be enslaved regardless of their father's feelings." The question of whether Edmund genuinely loved Rachel, or whether he simply convinced himself that his sexual exploitation of an enslaved woman constituted love, became the subject of considerable debate among historians studying the case. Some scholars argue that Edmund's willingness to violate social conventions and to risk his marriage demonstrated genuine emotional connection that transcended the power dynamics inherent in owner-slave relationships. Others contend that calling such relationships love ignores the fundamental inequality and coercion that characterized any interaction between a master and the human beings he owned, and that Edmund's feelings, however genuine they seemed to him, were ultimately expressions of the same possessive entitlement that defined all aspects of slavery. The Civil War, which began less than 4 years after the Willowbrook tragedy, was interpreted by some observers as divine judgment on a society that had produced such moral corruption and violence. The parallel between Katherine's murderous rage destroying her family and the larger societal violence that would destroy the plantation system itself was noted by abolitionists who saw both as inevitable consequences of attempting to build civilization on the foundation of human bondage and systematic sexual exploitation. The fact that Virginia would be devastated by war while formerly enslaved people celebrated their liberation seemed to some like cosmic justice for a system that had enabled tragedies like the one at Willowbrook. The site of Willowbrook Plantation itself changed hands multiple times over the following decades, with each successive owner discovering that the property carried a reputation that made it difficult to attract quality labor or to operate profitably. By the 1870s, portions of the former plantation had been purchased by formerly enslaved families who established small farms on land where their ancestors had labored in bondage. Rachel's cottage, where the murders occurred, was eventually burned down by persons unknown, though local legend claimed that formerly enslaved people had destroyed it as a way of erasing a site associated with both forbidden love and murderous violence. The graves of Edmund, Katherine, and Rachel became sites of different forms of memorialization that reflected how various communities understood the tragedy. Edmund and Katherine were buried in the family cemetery with markers that made no mention of the circumstances of their deaths, their children apparently wanting to forget, rather than commemorate the violence that had orphaned them. Rachel was initially buried in the slave cemetery without marker, but in the 1890s, formerly enslaved people who had known her erected a stone that read, "Rachel, 1830-1857, beloved by many, murdered by one, may she rest in peace that eluded her in life." Modern historians studying the Willowbrook tragedy have documented extensive evidence from letters, court records, newspaper accounts, and oral histories provided by descendants of enslaved people who witnessed the events. The case has become a touchstone for discussions about the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, the psychology of slave-owning women who witnessed their husbands' infidelities but had no recourse, and the violence inherent in a system that treated human beings as property while expecting them to function as both workers and sexual partners for the people who owned them. Dr. Jennifer Williams, a contemporary professor of women's history at the University of Virginia, has written extensively about the Willowbrook case and its significance for understanding the psychological experience of plantation mistresses. Katherine Hartwell's murders force us to grapple with the fact that white women were both beneficiaries of slavery, who enjoyed the labor and service of enslaved people, and victims of a system that gave their husbands unlimited sexual access to enslaved women, while expecting wives to accept such exploitation without complaint. Dr. Williams argues in her book, Mistresses and Slaves, Power, Sexuality, and Violence in the Antebellum South. Katherine had every form of legal and social power except the ability to command her husband's affection or to end a marriage that had become unbearable. The murders she committed were monstrous, but they were also the desperate act of a woman trapped in a situation that her society had no mechanisms to resolve. The legacy of the Willowbrook tragedy extends into contemporary discussions about sexual violence, coerced relationships, and the ways that systems of oppression create psychological trauma for everyone they touch, including those who benefit from them. The story serves as a reminder that slavery corrupted not just the enslaved, but also the enslavers, creating situations where even genuine emotion became tainted by power dynamics that made free choice impossible, where legal marriage provided no protection against emotional abandonment, and where the fundamental violence of treating humans as property could erupt in unexpected ways that destroyed lives across racial boundaries. The devastating story of Edmund, Rachel, and Katherine challenges us to grapple with impossible questions about love, power, and the psychological destruction that slavery inflicted on everyone it touched. If this tale of forbidden affection and murderous jealousy has moved you or made you think differently about the human costs of a system that treated people as property while expecting them to function as emotional and sexual partners, let me know in the comments below. Share this video with others who appreciate these complex stories that refuse to offer simple moral judgments, but instead force us to confront the contradictions and violence inherent in American slavery. Subscribe for more incredible true stories that explore the hidden dimensions of plantation life, including the sexual exploitation, psychological trauma, and explosive violence that civilized Southern society tried desperately to conceal. These are the stories that remind us that slavery destroyed everyone it touched: the enslaved people who suffered its direct violence, the white men who exercised power without accountability, the white women who witnessed their degradation without recourse, and the children who inherited trauma from systems that had corrupted their parents beyond redemption. Until next time, remember that some tragedies have no heroes, only victims of systems so fundamentally evil that they poisoned every relationship they touched, including those that might have been love if they had occurred between free people rather than master and slave.